A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. Hello, this is Gil Crosby, and I'm excited to be with you again. Thank you for listening. And my guest today is Dr. Bernard Burns, Burnes, of the University of Stirling, who is, I have just getting to know Dr. Burns. I have had the pleasure of using some of his papers as sources in my own writing. I went to explore them today and realized that I had three more already collected that I have never even read. So I started feverishly reading them this morning, and we'll get to that. But he is a very accurate Lewinian scholar. So we have a shared interest, and there's not a whole lot of people that are really that interested in the details of Lewin's life and work. So I'm excited about this relationship. So we're just going to explore. So how are you, Bernard?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well indeed. I don't know what the weather's like where you are, but we're in Scotland. We're nearly in winter. It's cold. It's miserable. It goes dark early. But actually, other than that, it's a very nice place to be.
Nice. Well, it's a sunny day here as we're also getting towards winter. We're in like a month and a half of drought. It hasn't rained in 48 of the 50 U.S. states. We're having drought. So, climate change. We don't have to get into that right now.
Oh, I think that's an issue we could well spend another podcast on.
No doubt, no doubt, and democracy, which actually is related
Oh yes,
directly to
very much.
Lewin, and really how to change the human race's approach to climate change is, of course, also related to Lewin. But hey, I just enjoyed. We had a talk like a week ago, I guess, a video talk, and I just enjoyed it so much. And you've written a new paper. You sent it to me about Lewin's early life,
Yeah.
and I went to read it thoroughly this morning and ended up reading a 2014 paper instead about field theory that I had never read. Ewan Cook on Lewin's field theory.
Yeah, my old mate Bill Cook. Yeah, good guy.
Yeah, and I found that fascinating. Now, one thing that uh, my father, okay, so there's a simple field theory diagram in there used by a government agency, the health agency,
Oh
maybe.
yes, what we refer to as the National Health Service in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah,
Is it force field analysis? FFA. Yeah, force field
yes,
analysis.
yes, and I share your assessment in the paper. Now, it was a long time ago. I don't know if you remember, but that it was so simplified as to be sort of like not nearly the Lewinian approach that it is sort of claimed to be. Uh, so an expert sort of organized it into driving forces and restraining forces. What I was taught by my father instead was to have the a cross section mostly made up of hourly workers uh, come up with their own brainstorm of what is in the way. And it could be social or technical. So, coming out of Tavistock's social technical system stuff, but and they identify the critical barriers, what they think is holding things back. And so it's not an expert doing the analysis with a little diagram. It's the what I think Lewin did was he would change the semi-quasi equilibrium or the homeostasis from the get-go in his studies with food habits by having the people that were supposed to change come up with their own solutions instead of just being told what to do. And see, I think that's already a change in the restraining force. Just being lectured at just doesn't work. And so you're already changing the fields. If you really have people from their own subjective experience engaged.
I mean, what Lewin basically said was that before you can begin any change exercise, you have to unfreeze people's reason for behaving as they do. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, why do we behave as we do? And the only people who know that are the people who are doing it. So, like you, whenever I go into an organisation, I always start with people at the front line, shop floor, or wherever they are, and I sit down with them and I talk to them, and I get them to tell me about their experiences. I get them to see what it is they're trying to achieve, what gets in the way that they're trying to achieve, and we build up a rapport. We start developing things, and this is one of Lewin's, I think, key things. He said people will not change unless they see that there is a good reason for them to change. And only by engaging them in discussion, and if it is the case, getting them to realize that the behaviors which may have been fine in the past are no longer fine now, and therefore they need to change. But unless they recognize the need to change, no matter what you do, they're not going to change. You can't change people by telling them to change. And this was, as you said, the food habits experiments that Lewin did in the Second World War, where um, uh, first of all, the government said to housewives, because housewives are buying food, these are the gatekeepers. They said, you've got to buy these foods rather than those foods. And housewives said, quite rightly, go away. We know what we're doing. The second thing they got housewives together and said, well, let's talk to them as a group because the group are powerful. And they lectured them on why they needed to change. And these people, and the housewife says, yeah, well, you're just telling us what to do again. The third thing was Lewin got them together and said, let's have a discussion about this. Let's see what you're buying, what else there is, what else you could do. So there was a discussion on it. And at the end he said, now let's vote on it. Do you want to change or don't you want to change? It is your choice. And lo and behold, after the discussion that they'd freely been involved in, they said, yeah, we want to change. And because it was their decision, they stuck to it. You and I have both experienced occasions in our working life where somebody's come along to you and said, Bernard, Gil, your area is not working. I want you to make these changes, get on with it. And we've stepped back and we've said, well, actually, let's have a look at your argument. I'm not sure I agree with your argument. I certainly don't agree with what you're asking me to do. I don't see why I should waste my time. I'm not going to do it. Alternatively, if clever managers come along to us and say, Bernard, Gill, we think there might be a problem. Could you look into it? Put together a team, look into it, see what the issues are. So we go look into it, we see what the issues are, and we come up with some joint recommendations from the group. And then because some bosses have really smartly turned around and said, and now you implement them. They don't say we're going to send somebody else in to implement them. You implement them. And because there are recommendations, because there are choices, we want to make them work. We also want to show how clever we are that we can make them work. So this issue of talking to people who are experiencing the change, talking to them as the group that's experiencing the change, and getting them to solve the issue is really important. Lewin understood this from the start. I think we have lost a lot of that in organisations. There's still an awful lot of people who believe that you have to tell people what to do rather than getting them to identify what the issues are and make the changes themselves.
Yep. If they come up with their own solutions, they're much more likely to pull them off, be motivated.
Yeah, and it is about motivation. People motivated to change because change is not easy. We all
Right.
know in our lives, whether it's working lives or personal life, change is not an easy thing. It takes effort, and why should we waste our effort on something we don't think is going to succeed or we don't understand?
Sure. If it makes sense, people don't resist change if it makes sense to them.
Do you remember those
But it's
things?
pretty rare that,
Yeah.
but go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, you remember those things that you used to get? People may still do it, where they say, you've got to trust me. I'm going to stand behind you, and I want you to lean backwards and fall, and I'm going to catch you. And whether you do that or not rather depends on whether or not you trust the person behind you. And in most cases, in organisations, people have a certain distrust of their managers because they've seen how
Absolutely.
they've operated in the past. And therefore, asking them to sort of take a leap in the dark or lean backwards in the hope that somebody will catch them is not something that they are freely going to do, or it's going to be, or that's necessarily going to be successful.
Absolutely. And if I was the one that came up with the solution, then of course it makes sense to me. And I'm also going to be motivated to make it work. And so anyway, all that changes the field. Now, I mostly work with intact teams. We don't organize separate new teams to.
Good.
We just actually have the workers in a team say what's in the way and what can you do about it. And they have plenty of, like, they need spare parts. They, I mean, they know exactly what they need that they're not getting, and then they may have to have conversations with other groups and with the people above. But it doesn't. It's not hard for people to identify what would make things better once they actually trust that they're going to be listened to. Which is the tough thing. There has to be that clarity from above that actually we're going to take this serious because it makes more sense. But
Well, it's
anyway,
interesting to ask the question, why don't people in positions of authority consult with their workers? Why don't they listen to them? And increasingly over the years, it seems to me that one of the answers to that is that people in positions of authority are unsure about their own abilities. And if you're unsure about your own abilities, you are afraid to show what you don't know to other people. So involving them, getting them to critique things, it's not something you want to do. And I think that managers who are confident in their own abilities are quite happy to listen to criticism, are quite happy to let other people run with it, things, are quite happy to delegate. But managers who aren't confident in their abilities uh, find it much more difficult to do that. So, leadership is important in organisations. Developing leadership is important in organisations, but allowing developing leaders in such a way that they don't feel threatened by involving people, I think, is
mhm.
crucial. And you see this in leadership styles. You look at the various categories of leadership styles that we see, and some of them are about involving people, others are about telling people, and different styles work in different situations. But in change situations, involving people is one of the key things.
It's critical, and you may have to tell them some. Like one of my favorite leaders that I worked with said, "Look, we're the highest cost producer of alumina in the worldwide Alcoa aluminum plant system. So if there's ever a crisis, we'll be the first to go." And so we need to get to being tied with the top. This was a little Jamaican plant. They wanted to be tied with the top two Australian plants, which were huge in comparison. He thought that was good enough. And so he had to tell them that this is the goal. And then he, with our help, engaged the entire organization in coming up with doing a force field analysis the way we do it, where they are the ones identifying what's in the way and what are the most important barriers, and then coming up with their own solutions and implementing them. And they got there within half a year. They went from being worst to first. So there's I you can there has to be structure, freedom and structure, leadership and structure. That was Lewin's leadership model. The Democratic model was that there was leadership, but not too much, and there was freedom, but not too much.
Yeah, I mean the traditional action research approach, whereby You've got the people who are going to have to make the change. You've got representatives of the senior echelons of the organisation, and you've got a facilitator to work them together. It's not one or the other. It's not one facing the other. It's that we're all involved in this. You can't usually in organisations you can't make significant changes without the people at the top of the organisation, without their authority, without their understanding what's going on. But also you can't make effective changes without the rest of the organisation as well, because they've got to, as we've just been talking about it, they've got to agree that the changes are worth doing, that the effort's worth putting in, and that it will improve the situation, rather than merely allowing people in senior positions to say, look, we've got this great initiative going, and then 2 years later say, oh, it didn't work, we're doing something different now.
Yep. Yep, you have to break the homeostasis or the semi quasi equilibrium. I find homeostasis an easier word, even though I appreciate that Lewin wanted to keep in mind that things are always in some flux. I mean, is what I understand from that. But the homeostasis of tension between management and labor, where the management thinks that they have to get the workforce to do stuff despite their resistance, and the labor thinks they have to get the job done despite the stupidity of the management.
I mean, it goes back to McGregor, theory X, theory Y, and it's how managers see the organisation. If you basically see workers as untrustworthy, and the only way that you can get them to work is either to bribe them or to shout at them or to both, theory X, then that's how you behave, and that's how people will respond to you. If you take a theory Y view, which is much more in line with the Lewinian view, and you say,
Mm-hmm.
well, actually, people are trustworthy, people want to be involved in their organisation, people want to come to work to do a good job. We've got to find ways of working with them to achieve that. That's a different thing. And McGregor said in his time, this we've got far too many theory X managers, and we've still got far too many theory X managers, despite the fact that many managers now will tell you that you know employees are our greatest asset. We've got to involve people in everything we do, etc., etc. There's still a lot of shouting at them and telling people what to do.
Yes. Yeah. Because of frustration, and like you said, the whole thing reinforces having a sense of helplessness at the top and in the middle and at the bottom. To borrow from there's another theorist that seeing systems he wrote, where he divides it into those three structures and says you can predict people's behaviors based on where they are in the system. Uh, Oshry, it's I think a helpful perspective. But hey, so I have a request. Your new paper, and you're writing a book, correct?
Yes, I'm doing the most silly, one of the most silly things you can do, which is to write a biography of somebody. I'm writing a biography of Lewin.
And especially to help bring to life his early years,
I think
or is it morphing?
one of the uh, one of the things that I found over the years about Lewin is just the degree to which we focus on the years 1939 until his death in 1947, and we
Sure.
don't really understand what went before that. And the standard view, and for many years, I would also say I align with this view, was that Lewin was a leading child psychologist. Then in 1939, Alfred Marrow said to him, would you like to come into my clothing company and sort out the problems I've got with my workforce? And I've been puzzled for many years. How come he went to a child psychologist to do that? I mean, you may go to a child psychologist for many things, but you probably wouldn't go to a child psychologist and say, can you sort out my labour relations problem? And indeed, if you told your workforce that you're bringing a child psychologist in to sort them out, I think the response may not be positive.
Sure.
And so
They
that was,
think that you had lost your
yeah.
marbles.
So that was a puzzle to me. And then you have to sort of go back and say, well, there's also the people who say, well, Louis never developed this three-step model. It was something he threw out at the end of his life, unfreezing, moving, refreezing, or freezing, as he actually called it. Uh,
Yes.
the difference is that he started to use those words towards the end of his life. But unfreezing was, how do you unfreeze a quasi stationary equilibrium? refreezing or freezing again is how do you reform that quasi-stationary equilibrium? And the
In
only way, yeah,
a in a better way,
in a
a
better
new.
way, yeah, yeah, you move to a better place. How do you stop people retreating from the better place? It's rather like dieting. Anybody can lose weight. The problem is to sustain the weight loss. And many
Yes.
organizations make big changes, but then you go back a year later and they're back where they started. You will have come across this, the 1980s, early 90s. We were all into quality improvement, quality control, quality groups, and many companies in Europe and America spent small fortunes on uh, teaching all these quality techniques to their workforce, and they never worked. And the reason they didn't work, of course, is that they were trying to change tools, techniques, and actually what they needed to do was change behavior. So with Lewin, you look back and say, okay, I can understand that what he's trying to do is change behavior, but where did he get from child psychology to adult and social psychology? And that's where you go back to the paper you just referred to. When I've looked at his work, what did he do for his PhD, etc. And one of the things you find out is that for his PhD, he starts to develop this idea that if you wish to understand behavior, you've got to understand people in the round. People are not Pavlov's dog. We don't just respond to a ringing bell. It's the context within which we live, and how that context holds us in a certain position, or that context, those forces change, and we move. But it's the First World War, of course. He finished his PhD, he hadn't graduated from his PhD, straight into the First World War. But he's still a psychologist. And at one point in the war, he gets seconded to a government body, which is looking at the training of, I think it was radio operators. And this is Lewin's first encounter with applied psychology, taking psychology out of the lab, applying it to adults, and getting people to change for the better. At the same time,
Although,
yeah, go on.
well, you could say that the paper that you cite,
Yeah,
that I think is a lovely paper, that he wrote about his experience as a soldier in
yeah,
World War I, was applied psychology, using himself as a
yeah,
subjective,
yeah.
uh, as his own guinea pig.
I think that's exactly right. And but there are other things he's doing at that time, other applied psychology
Hmm.
experiments he's carrying out. Looking, I think he did something with farm workers and others. So even in the 1910s to 1920, he's actually involved in applied psychology with adults. If you then look at what are the foundations of his career in the 1920s, early 1930s, the Berlin experiments, yes, many of these are with children, but almost all of them also involve adults. So it's not just children he's looking at; he's also looking at adults as well. And
And to understand human behavior
yeah, I
within
always
a
say
field.
that's right. Lewin is not a child psychologist in the 1920s and 30s. He's a psychologist where some of his work looks at children, but some of his work looks at adults. You also see in that period that force field analysis or field theory, which we've been talking about, that's where he brings it to fruition. And he brings it to fruition through a series of groundbreaking experiments where he's looking at both children and adults and how they behave and why they behave in a particular context and what happens if you change that context. So he's developing these things, but also in the 1920s, he's also in applied psychology. He's also applying that psychology. He works with a wallpaper factory. He works in textile companies. He works in a prison. So he's developing these things. So when Marrow says in 1939, "Excuse me, Professor Lewin, would you like to come and sort my company out for me?" He's not asking Lewin, the child psychologist. He's asking Lewin, the psychologist. Lewin, who has been developing social psychology, so he's looking at groups in industry and society, and he's asking Lewin, who has developed these tools and techniques for changing behavior. And one of the things I'd always remind people of is that Lewin is talking about changing behavior. There's often a misunderstanding that Lewin is talking about changing entire organizations. You change behavior, you change organization. But he's not talking about how you restructure organizations or necessary things like that. He's saying you start
No.
with changing behavior. And this is
Yes.
where, people, Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, I have a lot of time for Rosabeth Moss-Cantor. I think she's a great academic. I think she's a great change person. But she brought in this idea of Lewin's view as being the ice cube. You unfreeze the ice cube, it flows, and you refreeze the ice cube. And she says organizations are never frozen. They're not ice cubes. This is a bad analogy. And and he wasn't talking about organisations. He was talking about the behaviour of individuals and groups, and that behaviour is frozen. As I said
Even,
earlier,
I
so
mean, it's a metaphor.
yeah, it's a
It's
metaphor, but it's not a good metaphor.
well, I think it's a pretty good. I mean, the freeze, change, unfreeze, change, freeze. That's the metaphor. That
What I mean is by that, the way that people have used that metaphor is
yeah, I think
means that they don't understand what does Lewin mean by unfreeze. Well,
that
Lewin, in those later papers just before he dies, it's actually quite clear. But in order to understand it, you've got to understand what's gone before. You've got to understand what
I
they were doing in the 20s and 30s.
and I'll just say that even without understanding that, which I didn't when I was first applying it, but I was just following my father's instructions, but they worked.
As you should.
Uh, yeah, and they worked. But we it does apply or to organizations. But now we work with every group in an organization
Yeah, but it
usually.
applies to organisations in terms of the behaviour of
Absolutely,
individuals and groups, and particularly, as Lewin
any
said, it's
change,
groups.
any change you have to change. That's the unfreeze, duh. And then it has to be something like the leadership in the organization realizes that they have not done a very good job of listening to and involving the workforce. Well, if they get that, then you've already created a significant
Oh, yes.
change that's sustainable. And so, I mean, my work, I've been involved since the beginning, and again, I have to give credit to others who taught me, but there's not a big resistance to that once they start thinking about it and getting results, and it's just it's sustainable. Unlike quality circles where they didn't think systemically and have uh, people throughout the organization helping to create the approach. They just tried to cookie cutter it and jam it in and then force it through teaching, the way I understand it. And
Telling people this is what you do this, you do that, you
yeah,
do that.
yeah, yeah.
Not
This is the best
understanding
way.
why they wanted to do it, not understanding why they should do it, not
Yep.
necessarily changing the behaviour. This has always worked in the past. Why won't it work in the future? They didn't engage them, and the people who were rather like the tea groups, the people who were delivering these things, you ended up with people who didn't really understand what they were doing. That they in turn were just following these are the rules and regulations.
Yep.
Whereas I work with Nissan in the UK for many years in the late 80s, early 90s. And to see the way that they ran their group improvement activities, particularly the people on the line. If there was a problem on the production line, the group would be expected to sit down and sort it out themselves. If they saw an issue, if they saw a way of improving it, they could do it themselves. But this is what really, I think, impressed me about Nissan. It costs thousands and thousands of dollars if the production line is stopped for even a couple of minutes.
Yes.
But the people on the production line had the authority to press a stop button if they thought there was something wrong and needed to be fixed then. They,
Good.
you know, that's bad. I mean, I don't, I'm not necessarily sure I've ever heard of an instance where it's been used, but the fact that they could do that
Hmm.
I think is important. The fact that they were seen as being important enough to do that. Another thing Nissan did, I don't know if they still do it, but any time a manager came into the organisation, before they took up their managerial role, they were expected to spend a couple of weeks working on the production line so that they
Nice.
understood what they were doing. That everything focuses around the production line. You've got to understand what goes on down there. And therefore, by working on it, you'll have a better idea of whether you're standing in people's way or whether you're assisting them.
The organizations like the one I'm working with right now that's new, where all we've done so far is two T group workshops with the top management people. But now we're starting to work with the work teams, all the work teams. But right away, they started saying, you know what, we're going to have all the managers spend some time in the production line
Yeah.
in various parts of the organization. Uh, which that was just their idea. They decided to do it. We don't tell them what to do. we just help them start to listen to each other and listen and organize what they're going to do. But hey, I have a request for your book. I would like to know more, and so maybe you'll find out, maybe you won't. But it depends on your own interest. But early on, also Lewin integrated anthropology into his thinking, and he formed a long relationship with Margaret
Yep.
Mead. And to me, that's only lightly touched on in the materials I have, like his own papers on the food studies that he did, and I think at some point he says that really it was Margaret Mead and him together. He's not even sure who said it first that came up with the term group dynamics. But that's a part of his life that I'm really curious about, and maybe maybe you're already diving in or will dive into.
Yeah, I've got to that. There's a wonderful quote from Margaret Mead, I think, which goes something like this: "Small groups can change the world. In fact, small groups have only ever changed the world." And she's talking about how can we bring people together to work as groups to get things done. We don't change it by the great and the good, issuing announcements from on high to tell us we've got to behave like this or we've got to behave like that. But one of the reasons why Lewin was a Gestalt psychologist, but he wasn't a standard Gestalt psychologist, and he fell out with quite a few of the leading Gestalt psychologists towards the end of the 1920s and in the 1930s. Because Lewin said, yeah, Gestalt psychology, this holistic way of understanding people, is important, but we've also got to understand that the context is far broader than just the individual. So he said, we've got to understand the sociology of the situation people. And so he worked with sociologists. We've got to understand how groups form, how they develop, etc. Anthropologists are very good on this. So he was very good at bringing in and amalgamating other disciplines into what he was doing.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I'm less clear about who were the leading sociologists that he worked with. So that's also an interesting
I
string.
forgot the name of the guy he worked with, worked most closely with, but he wrote a number of papers with him.
But his social science was truly interdisciplinary,
Oh yes,
including his topological experiments, which I agree with your 2014 paper. Uh, it's just too bad Lewin died when he was 50, 57.
my advice to anybody is don't die young.
Yeah, yeah,
I think
that's
this is
good
very
advice.
good advice.
Huh. Yeah.
It's terrible for your career.
Who knows what he would have done with that? He might have stayed stumped. Really, I think he was onto something. It excited him, and especially when it got into the really advanced mathematical application of trying to describe psychology through math. And boy, it certainly loses me, and I'm not like a great math scholar anyway. So,
I,
uh,
I think there are three things I'd say. One is once you start using that sort of mathematics and making it that complex, the issue of how you involve the group in that becomes very difficult because you automatically most are excluded because they'll take one look at that diagram and they'll just go blank as we all do. So, I mean, I
yeah.
think it was a misstep in that sense. The other thing is that the mathematics didn't exist at that time to allow him to do that. Though I was reading something this morning about him doing a presentation to the Berlin Mathematical Society in 1932, and they actually were very interested in the way he
Uh huh.
developed his mathematics. And I read something a while ago where a mathematician saying, well, topology, which is what he based it on, is actually now much more developed, and you could probably do what Lewin was trying to do. Because what he was trying to do is he said, topology, my force field analysis, my force field theories allow me to understand the situation as it stands, understand what needs changing, but I can't predict change. And he was trying to use mathematics to say, if I change this force, what's going to happen to all these other forces? So, and I'm not sure change necessarily needs that degree of precision.
I
Uh,
don't think it does because it is predictable that if you actually let people come up with their own solutions and implement them, that they're going to get stuff done, and it changes the whole atmosphere of the organization. But you don't have to put that into mathematical formula to, that might be a nice extra thing to help turn it into a research paper or something. But to actually do change,
I mean,
it,
teaching people some simple tools and techniques, things like fishbone analysis and things like that, are quite useful to try and get them to understand what the causes of a problem are for themselves.
sure.
But when you start saying you've got to use advanced mathematics, I think that becomes a more difficult thing to sell.
But
But
it
nevertheless,
is
I mean, the way what even Lewin, I think, on occasions didn't necessarily always use his mathematics. I think he went for much more discussion with people and allowing people to develop their own ideas. So I think you're right.
absolutely.
Nobody knows how he would have developed. I can't believe he would have stayed with what he got, and indeed his close associates like Alfred Marrow urged him to move back from, because people didn't understand it, even other academics didn't understand it. And once he
Sure,
died, yeah,
Lippet was an egghead, and a close friend of my father's for his last 30 years, and he didn't try to use the mathematical formula, except all that experimentation led to some representations like behavior as a function of personality and the environment, which is a lovely
oh, it's a lovely formula.
simplification.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
But the thing is,
so
to understand why that is important, we're looking at ourselves fine. In Lewin's time, that was actually a very controversial thing to say. Because if you remember, the behaviorists were still uh, almost in their infancy, but growing in power in the 30s and 40s. The idea that
sure.
the idea is we respond to what's happened in the past. If somebody's hit us in the past and they raise their hand in the future, we will cringe. Pavlov's dogs and salivating. What Lewin was saying, no, it's more complex than that. It's actually
Nature and
understand.
nurture.
Yeah, that's right. It's understanding the full environment, understanding how we as individuals and groups interact with that environment. And if you can't do that, you can't bring about change. Incidentally, also one of the reasons why he fell out with Freud.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Freud certainly wasn't just Gestalt.
No, Freud's view, and let's not take away. I mean, Freud was a giant in the field of psychoanalysis. What Freud's view was to say, actually, if people have got a problem, you've got to go back into their past, untangle those problems, and through long periods of psychoanalysis, get them to come to face up with them.
Hmm.
Lewin took a slightly different view, and it was that actually people are having problems now. What is it in their context which has which has triggered it now rather than last week or next week? And can we change something in that context which will allow them to improve their situation rather than needing years of psychoanalysis? And actually, that's quite near some of the talking therapies that we see being used in modern situations. So Lewin, in many ways, was ahead of himself, ahead of people on that. So Ian Freud did. Lewin didn't necessarily disagree with Freud's analysis, but he said actually there may be different ways of actually curing the problems or addressing the problems that people have got because of their personal history. So it's interesting that the two big psychologists of the age came at the issue from different ends of the spectrum, if you like.
Yeah, and
Freud from the past, Lewin from the present.
I think even Freud and Jung and others in their own way, they did talk about more like the whole family
Yeah.
system, and it just wasn't their primary focus in their analysis and their writings. But uh, there was something you said that I wanted to respond to. Oh, well, just the simplicity of Lewin's the evidence from his own research and the absolute evidence from my own life experience. I mean, I'm a practitioner. I've certainly I am part of a university, the Leadership Institute of Seattle. It's a graduate program that is now going through accreditation again. So I can't say it's accredited because it isn't, but it will be again. It looks like that Dad started in 1969. So I could be called an academic, but mostly I'm a practitioner. And if you help leaders throughout a system shift towards more of the democratic principles that Lewin taught of leading, but also allowing as much freedom as possible, then the majority of the people in the system can easily shift from being demoralized, which includes all kinds of emotional and physical problems, ailments, and to being having much more high morale in their work and higher performance. And it influences their personal lives, also their own families. And so you can shift the collective experience of a lot of people through group dynamics, which is so much quicker than trying to do it one by one and help them cope with living in a demoralized system by just getting therapy. So to me, I'm totally a believer in group dynamics as a way of creating a better society, even.
Yeah.
Now I rambled on. You're there?
No, no,
You good?
I agree with you. I think how do you, how, this issue of democracy, because that's what Lewin meant when he was saying we've got to involve people in making decisions about their own lives, whether these lives are within organisations or outside organisations. That's democracy. Uh,
With
uh,
structure.
with well, democracy has to have structure. You can't have
Yeah.
democracy without structure. You know, you have to have some mechanisms, and
And he
we have
thought
to
the
recognise.
structure was too weak in Germany after World War
Oh
One,
yeah,
for instance. So, uh,
yeah. But within organisations, you know, organisations exist for a purpose. Uh,
mhm.
Uh, first of all, you've got to get people to agree that that's the right purpose to follow. But once they do, then decisions have to be taken, changes have to be made, which allow you to pursue the purpose. Often in organisation, it's not just that people disagree with the purpose; they don't understand the purpose of the organisation because different parts of the hierarchy emphasise different things, and then sometimes they seem to be in direct contradiction to each other.
Yes, often they are. Not just seems to be.
No, and we've all worked. You, me, most of the people who are listening to this, we've all worked in organisations. We know how organisations operate. This is why when managers come along and try and kid us about things, we say, that's not our experience."
I mean, the parts department is often rewarded for lowering costs and reducing
Yeah, yeah.
inventory without really understanding or paying attention to or worrying about their impact on the overall productivity of the organization. And so, anyway, it's just easy to have conflicting goals and goals that actually hurt.
Oh yes, yes. I mean, is it Goldblatt who developed the sort of organisations as pipeline theories in the 70s? And he said some bits of the pipe are very wide, some bits of the pipe are very narrow. And he said, what you've got to do in order to improve the overall organisation is you've got to look at the narrow bits and expand them a bit. But the wide bits are the ones which look very inefficient. So people often say, "Oh, that's an inefficient area. We must go in and put a lot of time making them more efficient." It's a wide bit. It's not a pinch point. You've got to look at the pinch point. So you've got to understand how organisations operate, and that means you've got to somebody in the organisation has got to be capable of seeing the entire organisation, or some groups have got to be capable of seeing the entire organisation. Uh, and I always give people the example of the uh, 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 the story of the blind men who go to see what an elephant's like, and one of them grabs the leg and says, "Well, an elephant's like a tree trunk." Another grabs the tail and says, "An elephant's like a rope." Another grabs the a tusk and says, "It's like a spear." And they all go round, and they're all feeling bits of the organisation, bits of the elephant. They're all exactly accurate about what they've got. But it's only when the blind men, sit down and discuss what they've got that they begin to get a mental picture of what an elephant's like. And it's the same with organisations. Different people sitting at different points in the organisation see different bits. It's only when we can bring those viewpoints together we see the entire organisation, what works, what doesn't work, what we need to change.
That's why we, I again, I didn't think of this. I just got taught it, but we use T group methodology in organizations where we mix uh, hourly, the CEO, people in the middle. We mix them all together where they're talking about work, but they're also working on how they listen to each other and how they handle emotions. And uh, so they start to understand the whole elephant a bit more. When you have hourly workers mixed in with top management, having a open conversation, as open as possible, about what it's really like to be in the organization. It's powerful. But and that's again, I have to tip my hat to Mr. Lewin for the accidental discovery of the T group and the beginning of it back in '46. So this has been lovely. This has been a great start. I think maybe we're going to need to do more of these. Is there something you would like to make sure you say or talk about in our remaining time here?
All I would say is that I have my 10 rules for organisation change. I won't go into them now. But my first rule is we need less change but better change. Organisations are spending lots of time saying we've got to change this, we've got to change that, we've got to do this, rushing around making masses of change, most of which fail. And I think organisations need to look at themselves and say, okay, we've got 100 things we could change. What are the five or six which are really important? And then put the time and effort into that. Because you'll never be able to involve people. You'll never be able to get people's time and effort into something if they're trying to do too many things at once. Put all the expertise in a few things. Once you've done those, then you can maybe start developing to not five, maybe six or seven. But at the moment, we're trying to make far too many changes in our organisation and we're doing it badly. We need fewer changes but better change. And that's my rule number one for change.
100% agree. I actually wrote a chapter in one of my books, Leadership Can Be Learned, called Stability is Good.
Oh, yes.
Now, are you familiar? Now, here's another Lewin mystery. Lewin spoke at the Mendenhall Institute at least 2 different years, and later on, Murray Bowen and Edwin Friedman were both at that institute, and they both created Bowen really created a form of family systems theory that is based on field theory. And but never does Bowen in the what I have, and that's influenced my work. And Friedman writes about one of the five characteristics of chronically anxious systems. He says is the quick fix mentality,
Yeah.
where people are trying to do too many change things at once, and so they're killing all of them by because they aren't focusing enough on any one of them to do them right.
Yeah, I
Which
think, yeah.
anyway, as you dig, so that reminds me of what you just said. But as you dig, and if you find any information about, well, I mean, I could probably just find the name of the papers. What did Lewin teach to the Menninger Institute? And I would love to know if there's a link between Lewin and Bowen that's direct. But I haven't found it.
No, I think one of the issues is that many things, many different disciplines have been influenced by Lewin and Lewin's thinking, but often people don't realise that and don't make that connection. There's a behavioural economist, I've forgotten his name now, who won the Nobel Prize for behavioural economics, and and so this isn't a behavioural economist. He's an economist, so he's also a psychologist, and he said we are all Lewinians now. And the reason we're all Lewinians now is because we've come to realize the importance of context. And I think the importance of context has become one of the key factors we use in almost everything we do. But we haven't realized, I think, that where that stems from is Lewin. It stems from
Yes.
Lewin's work and impressing on people the need to understand context. And that I
Well,
think is,
and even in more simplistic terms, I think like the whole lean manufacturing, the idea that you're doing action research on processes, he was at least a big influence on that. Not
oh
necessarily
yeah.
only source, but uh, I met online recently a professor from Japan who's part of a Lewin group that has existed ever since Lewin visited Japan.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. I was just reading about that this morning too. A Japanese student, psychology student, was visiting Europe, spent time with Lewin in about 1923, 1924, and then went back to Japan and formed the, I think, Japanese Psychological Institute. And he's the guy who invited Lewin over in 32, 33 to come and
Uh-huh.
visit. And that's because he'd spent a year with Lewin. I think he wrote a paper with him. And one of the interesting things about the 1920s and Lewin, uh, the number of international scholars who came to Berlin, who came to the Psychological Institute where Lewin was, and either they came to see Lewin or after they'd been there a few weeks, they thought, this guy's really interesting and spent time with him. It's quite fascinating.
And the number of women,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
which was not the norm in 1920 in academia.
But it's very interesting if you, I mean, certainly quite a lot of them were Russians or East Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and the first few they come across basically to do education and psychology, but there was no education department school at Berlin, so the Berlin University, so they gravitated to the Institute of Psychology, and they were looking for supervisors, and it's very difficult to understand why they all ended up with Lewin. Partly, I think, because Lewin wasn't a tenured member of staff, and he was also Jewish. And you should never discount the Jewish connection with Lewin and how much that impacted him. I think he had difficulty getting what you might call homegrown students, but a lot of the foreign students, who maybe some of his colleagues wouldn't take,
Mm-hmm.
he took. But these were really bright people,
Yes.
really, really bright people, and the work they did was first class. But you know, as I say, it was a wonderful time, I think, to be an academic in Berlin because you had so many people coming across. The world was in such a flux that uh, people from different disciplines, different countries actually got together. And of course, once they spent time with Lewin, they went back to their own countries, like J.F. Brown in the States, and told people, this guy's got something, we ought to listen to him. And going back to your thing about Japan, this is where the Japanese connection comes in, and this is why it's important. You trace it back to Lewin.
Well, he also taught the same in alignment with his social science theories, which is to say, from my impression, it was a lively dialogue with his students, and that was radical. It's still radical. It's, uh,
Oh, and it
he
was certainly radical in Germany at that time. You were the professor
absolutely.
there. Lewin tells this lovely story of Stumpf, who supervised his PhD. So Lewin wants to do a PhD with Stumpf, big major figure in psychology, runs the Psychological Institute. Lewin never sees him. He writes his proposition, gives it to Stump's assistant. Assistant takes it to Stump. Stump reads it and says, "Okay, I'll supervise it." And Lewin said, "For the next 4 years, I got on with my PhD. I never at any point discussed it with Stump. I
Yeah,
never met him personally to discuss it."
right. And the classrooms were just lectures.
Yeah, apart from Lewin, who apparently everybody sat there to listen to the great and good lecture, and Lewin would ask them questions, which
Yes.
you can assume didn't necessarily make him all that popular with the great and the good. But when he became a professor, when he became a lecturer, that's what he did. He talked to
Yep.
people, involved them. He would often take them home for dinner. He'd take them out to the cafe. Uh, God help them if they had an important date to get to, because once Lewin started talking to you, he could be talking to you into the middle of the night.
Yep. Yep. It would be wonderful. We'll have to do that
Yeah,
sometime. But
that would be good. It has been very, very nice talking to you. And actually, talking to you, and as you know, I'm a great admirer of your father. So, I mean, this is a privilege for me to talk to you. And very much as I always say, please pass my regards on to your father.
well, I'll do that. And if you could just call him, Bernard. Uh, he's home right now. and always is.
But
So
if you can give me his email address, I'll drop him a
I'll,
note.
I'll gladly do that. He's 96 and he's not very mobile, and he's still sharp as as a tack, and so uh, I will gladly tell him, and
That would be very nice to talk to him.
he would get a big thrill out of you calling. He will welcome it. Oh,
Because
by
we're
the way,
yeah.
he's teaching a class tomorrow night uh, online at 9 o'clock Eastern time, my time. So,
That's about 2 o'clock in my morning.
yes, that's a dilemma. Is it 3 o'clock in your morning, perhaps
3 o'clock in
even?
my morning. Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, yes. Well, who needs sleep?
I do. But yes, I would like to talk to him. If you can send me his email, I'll drop him a line and we can Skype sometime or Zoom.
Cool. Yes, yes. Uh, you, yeah, Zoom. He knows how to respond to Zoom. If you set up
Excellent.
Zoom, he can do it. Doesn't he?
Brilliant.
Doesn't do Skype. There's a limit.
Well, I think the problem we all found during the lockdown is that I was having meetings on about 4 or 5 different platforms. Is this Teams? Is this
Yes,
Skype? Is this
yes, yes,
Zoom? Some organisations seem to have their own bespoke platform which you had to use
yes.
or not use because they never gave you the password when they told you to connect in.
Okay. Hey, last thing I want to say is, just back to Lewin. His his theories about learning and teaching then also have been very important to me in my own work, and we're locked into his beliefs about what makes a functional democracy. So, and which is part of the reason why I think the United States is prone to autocracy, is that our educational system is mostly not doesn't have clear principles, and so it doesn't consistently help young people learn how to think for themselves
Yeah,
through dialogue. And any country that just teaches people to memorize the answers and obey the authorities is not a sound democracy.
yeah. I think once again, uh, you have to listen, respond, involve people. Otherwise, they won't be committed to this issue. People have to see that the decisions that are being taken uh, they can agree with, and that in some way, shape, or form they're going to benefit them. If you get to a point where, as a member of a society, where you think that actually the decisions that are being taken aren't benefiting you, and over time they're disbenefiting you, then that society is in a very poor position. And I think too many Western societies are in a poor position.
Yes, there's not a real clarity about how to be a citizen, be engaged, and how to lead a democracy. So anyway, but last thing, then that reminds me of Dewey,
Oh yes, yes, yes.
and I don't understand. So Binet and Bradford, I believe, were both students of Dewey.
I didn't know that.
That's what I think it says in Morrow. But
No,
somewhere I
go
read
back.
that.
Yeah, I'll
Somewhere I
go and
read
look at
that.
that.
What I and certainly Lewin and Dewey were like-minded. What I don't know is whether they ever had any relationship with each other. There's no evidence of it that I've seen
I would,
besides the
yeah,
students, the
I
colleagues.
would assume that they certainly knew of each other's work.
You would think.
And one of the things about Lewin is that he was an incredible networker.
Yes.
If he saw something that was interesting, he would pick up the phone and ring. He might not know you. You might be uh, somebody, a member of the great and good. He would pick up the phone and talk to you and say, "What about such and such?" So I'd be surprised if they weren't aware of each other's work. And at some level, I'd be surprised if they're not been in contact. How
Yep.
much
Yep.
contact is always debatable because Loon was rushing around all over the place. But it would be surprising if they hadn't come across each other.
So the big question, another opportunity as you do your research for your book, is if you is to keep sniffing around for Dewey Lewin connections.
So I'm trying to limit this to a relatively slim volume. Every time I talk to you, it gets slightly fatter.
That's the real reason I wanted to do a podcast with you, Baron. I have a list of things I want to know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's all good.
Brilliant.
Okay, well, lovely talking to you.
Very nice talking to you as well.
Thank you for listening, audience. This is a wrap, and uh, I really appreciate this, Bernard. Okay, take care. I'm going to end the recording.
Thank you very much.
Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby, and I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. It's many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day. And I invite you to do the same. Together, we can create high productivity and morale in organizations. We can create stronger foundations for democracy. We can create a better world.